The gates at Harland Wolff are closing. The shipyard that built the Titanic is out of time. Workers are locked out. Creditors are circling. Control is gone. The government has refused to intervene. No buyer has stepped forward. A 160-year-old industrial giant is about to vanish. Thousands of jobs are on the line. The collapse is not theoretical. It is happening now. This is not just another factory closure. Harland Wolff survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the decline of British shipbuilding. Now, it falls not to bombs or bankruptcy, but to a failure of alignment. The company, its workers, and the state all want survival. None can agree on the price. The result? Paralysis. The shipyard's fate is no longer in its own hands. The collapse exposes a deeper fracture. When survival depends on collective action, but no one is willing to move first, even icons can be left stranded. For decades, Harland Wolff was more than a shipyard. It was a symbol of industrial power. At its peak, it employed over 30,000 people. Its cranes dominated Belfast. The Titanic was only the most famous of hundreds of ships built here, but the world changed. Global competition intensified. Shipbuilding moved east. Harland Wolff shrank, pivoted, and survived until now. In the shadow of the Samson and Goliath cranes, a welder once etched his initials into a steel plate destined for a new ship. He said, "This yard built the Titanic. My father worked here. My son did too. We thought it would never end." But the world moved on. By the 1980s, the yard was a fraction of its former size. Oil rigs and ferries replaced ocean liners. The workforce dwindled. Each decade brought new restructuring. The company diversified into offshore energy and repairs, but the core business, large, capital-intensive projects, remained exposed to cycles of feast and famine. Survival depended on winning a handful of major contracts every few years. When those contracts stopped, the margin for error disappeared. The collapse is not about a single bad year. It is about incentives that no longer align. Harland Wolff's business depended on large, lumpy contracts, naval vessels, oil rigs, ferries. When orders dried up, the company relied on government support. But public money comes with conditions. Politicians want jobs protected, but not at any cost. Investors want returns, but not open-ended risk. Management wants to keep the yard alive, but cannot guarantee profitability. The core mechanism is a breakdown in risk sharing. For decades, the yard's survival depended on a tacit agreement. Government would step in during lean years, investors would tolerate volatility, and workers would accept uncertainty for the promise of future work. But as losses mounted, each party's willingness to absorb risk eroded. The government, facing budget constraints and scrutiny, hesitated to commit more funds. Investors, burned by thin margins, refused to inject new capital without guarantees. Management, caught between these forces, could only offer promises it could not keep. In a closed-door meeting, a union leader slid a letter across the table. "We'll occupy the yard if you announce closure." The CEO replied, "If payroll isn't met by Friday, there's nothing left to occupy." Outside, a creditor's email arrived. "Payment in full, or we seize assets Monday." The deadlock was total. As cash reserves dwindled, the company sought a buyer. None emerged. The government was asked for a bailout. Ministers hesitated. The optics of rescuing a historic shipyard are strong. The precedent is dangerous. If Harland Wolff is saved, why not every failing industrial relic? Each day without a decision narrowed the options. Suppliers demanded payment up front. Credit lines tightened. Workers threatened occupation. The board faced a choice: wait for a miracle or enter administration. The mechanism is not dramatic mismanagement or sudden catastrophe. It is a slow, grinding erosion of shared interest. Each stakeholder waited for someone else to take the first risk. No one moved. The result was a deadlock that became terminal. The inflection point came when the government drew a line. No more emergency funding, no guarantees. The board could not meet payroll. Creditors moved to seize assets. The workforce, once the company's strength, became a liability. Thousands of livelihoods, now a source of political risk. The shipyard's legacy, its history, its brand, none could be monetized fast enough. The assumption that Harland Wolff was too historic to fail collapsed. Recovery was no longer possible. The gates closed. The moment was not marked by a single dramatic announcement, but by a series of irreversible steps. Suppliers stopped delivering, banks froze accounts, workers arrived to find security guards at the gates. The company's last bargaining chips, its history, its reputation, its symbolic value, were suddenly worthless in the face of immediate financial obligations. The breakdown was total. There was no path back. This is not just the end of a shipyard. It is a case study in institutional risk. When incentives diverge between government, capital, and labour, survival becomes a negotiation, not a right. Legacy does not guarantee rescue. Political capital is finite. Industrial icons can become liabilities overnight. The collapse of Harland and Wolff shows how quickly power can shift when no one is willing to pay the price of preservation. The lesson extends beyond shipbuilding. Any institution that relies on implicit guarantees, whether from the state, investors, or its own legacy, faces the same risk. When the calculus changes and no party is willing to absorb the next loss, collapse can be sudden and absolute. The mechanisms that once protected these giants become constraints. The very factors that made them untouchable, history, scale, symbolic value, become irrelevant when incentives no longer align. A century ago, Harland and Wolff launched the Titanic with fanfare and pride. Today, its own fate is sealed in silence. The lesson is not about nostalgia or inevitability. It is about the quiet, final consequences when institutions outlive their incentives. In the end, even the most storied names can find themselves adrift, no longer too big, too historic, or too important to fail. And as banks, automakers, and even national utilities face similar fractures, the next collapse may already be underway. CapitalRifts, where money breaks,